Hello and welcome to some more Star Citizen. The latest patch 3.1.4D on the PTU, which is soon to go live, continues to address ESP, IFCS and the Gravlev system. This is ship movement, ship aiming and hover bikes and vehicles on planet surfaces. So the Gravlev system has sprouted a giant Q&A on Spectrum headed by John Pritchett, Senior Physics Programmer at CIG, in regards to the Gravlev system's current state, short-term goals, and the future of the feature. Nothing is really missing for Gravlev to be working fully. It's just broken in the live builds. The biggest issue was failing raycasts. A raycast is a line that in this situation gets shot out of the bottom of the vehicle and then tells you what objects or topology in the environment that ray runs into, and therefore how the vehicle should react, how the Gravlev system should react. These were not actually returning a hit to the bike at all, so it wasn't communicating what the raycast was hitting, so the bike has no idea where it is relative to the terrain. John is currently getting the system working as intended. So let's read that mega post from John on Spectrum. It's come to my attention that there's a lot of concern in the community about the direction of my Gravlev simulation. I can certainly understand this considering that it went out in 3.0 and was in a completely broken state. Many people have questioned my approach for the system without having the opportunity to see how it behaves when functioning as intended, and until 3.2 comes out, unless we can get it into the 3.1x patches, most people won't have an opportunity to experience a fully functional Gravlev. So until that time comes, I'd like to take the opportunity to discuss how Gravlev is expected to function and also answer any questions and hear concerns that people might have. In general, my expectation for Gravlev is that it will function somewhere in the region between ridiculously bouncy balloon and faked collision-driven vehicle, preferably closer to the latter than the former. Whether I'm using hidden wheels or the system I created, the vehicle is essentially travelling on a spring-based suspension. The main difference between my model and a traditional suspension between the vehicle and the wheels, or essentially between the vehicle and the ground, is that I'm actively driving the springs properties to elevate the vehicle to a goal elevation, rather than merely relying on a static dampened spring system to allow the vehicle to ride on a cushion over the terrain. Because of this, my model has a component to it that most hover systems don't, which is determining what elevation we want the vehicle to take. I use raycasts to gather data about the ground under the vehicle and also oncoming terrain, but I could just as easily use a physics collision mesh to gather this data. I felt that the raycast approach could be more efficient, but if it can't provide a sufficient resolution for the data for the Gravlev to function properly, of course I'll adapt. But this question is entirely about how I get data about the terrain, not about how the model uses that data to elevate the vehicle. So as you're hovering along, there is a designated hover height that the Gravlev control system wants to maintain. This is set per bike by the tuners. The Nox wants to sit very low because it's basically a street bike. The Dragonfly is a bit higher because it's more of an off-roader. But based on this desired elevation and the reading of the terrain under the vehicle, the Gravlev control system will attempt to maintain a given height above the ground. It does so with the same kind of spring that you'd have on a wheeled suspension, only this is a more stable and adaptive spring simulation than a static mass spring dampener system. At any moment I can indicate what elevation I want, how long I want it to take getting to that elevation, and what I want the maximum rising velocity to be, as well as what I want my maximum rising acceleration to be. This allows designers to tune a hover vehicle for a wide range of capabilities, from a street bike that struggles on rough terrain, to a cruising bike that's meant to hover mostly over moderately rough terrain, to an off-roader that's meant to feel every bump. In the first and second modes, it will feel very much like a Star Wars hover bike, which you generally see over reasonably flat terrain. For the last case, it's going to feel more like a boat or jet ski, and it should because my model shares a lot in common with buoyancy in water. But again, it's highly configurable, so designers can hopefully get a lot of different behaviours out of it, depending on the goals of a particular bike or other hover vehicle. Using the system, I have a lot more control over the hover behavior than I would using a traditional dampened spring system. For example, if the bike is falling from a high elevation, I can calculate at which point I need to turn on the hover spring in order for it to arrest the falling velocity and return to the desired hover height, just avoiding a hard collision with the ground. A more traditional spring-based system would just rely on the spring having reached its limits and you bounce with a hard collision. Traditional spring simulations aren't this adaptable and predictable. Because of this approach I've taken of maintaining a goal elevation and driving the hover vehicle up to that elevation or allowing it to settle back down if it's too high, the sense of that vehicle is too floaty or bouncy depends a lot on the logic that's used to set that elevation, and that's still a work in progress. The latest PTU test build feels like it's coming a long way, but the choice of elevation in no way determines how well the vehicle can react to changes in elevation. The system is very stable and adaptive and can achieve the goal motion very well. The key is defining the best goal elevation to take as the vehicle moves along at potentially very high speeds over unpredictable terrain, and that's an important consideration for systems like this. It isn't limited to designated tracks in-game, it can go anywhere, so it needs to be able to handle a very diverse set of conditions. It makes no assumptions about the terrain it will be flying over. Something else to keep in mind with the Star Citizen Gravlev vehicles is that they are a hybrid space hover vehicle. They do have thrusters as well that allows the vehicle to fly in space or atmosphere. Just because you enter hover doesn't mean those thrusters are unusable. The goal is for hover to be more efficient because you're not expending thrust to stay aloft. If tuned and balanced properly, I expect this to make hover mode a useful option relative to atmospheric flight. Otherwise, hover will be nothing more than a novelty that will wear off very quickly. But aside from just supporting atmospheric and spaceflight, Gravlev vehicles use thrusters while in hover mode. Gravlev hover doesn't provide any side, back, forward or downward force. It only provides upward force, and only gravity will keep the vehicle down. Designers can specify a minimum amount of gravity that they want the vehicle to operate under, and if the vehicle is on a lower gravity planet, the system will generate downward thrust to compensate for the lack of gravity to keep the vehicle down. This will guarantee that the vehicle will always perform as if it's in a heavy gravity environment, depending on the designer's settings. Dragonfly and Noxes are tuned for one Earth gravity. The Gravlev control system is not meant to have perfect information. It's supposed to be a skills-based experience system, so depending on how the vehicle is tuned, some will be easier to manage than others. And when I say skill-based experience, I mean literal player skill. It's not skills based on XP like an MMO. It's literally your player skill. The more you've learnt how to do that, the better you will literally be as a player at doing that. But you have control over the goal elevation of the vehicle, either by using strafe up or strafe down, or using pitch up and pitch down while in hover. This means as you're cruising along, if you think you might collide with an obstacle or sudden steep rise in elevation, you can increase your elevation to help the vehicle avoid that collision. This not only gives you an increase in elevation to clear the obstacle, but also improves your ability to climb a slope. All vehicles will have a limit to their ability to climb slopes, but using strafe up or pitch up will improve a vehicle's ability to climb. To break out of hover into atmospheric flight, you can use strafe up and hold it for a couple of seconds at max elevation. To avoid breaking out into SCM when climbing a steep slope, use pitch up to increase elevation instead. To drop back into hover from atmospheric flight, either strafe down towards the surface until you begin to drop into hover, or I'll slowly decrease your altitude as you fly until you are near enough to the ground that you drop back into hover. There currently isn't a manual command for switching between modes. In order to make Gravlev control more tactical, my model includes a zone of elevation within which the vehicle experiences nearly zero drag, the result of sort of a Gravlev ground effect. As long as you're keeping the bike down on flat terrain, you can drop into a very high speed groove. This is only really noticeable in Afterburner, where you're able to reach top Afterburner speeds when tight to the ground, but when in the air, drag will pull you back down to lower speeds due to terminal velocity. This makes it important that you choose the optimal path to avoid unnecessary jumps when you're trying to make good time. Especially in a race, the path you choose and your ability to navigate through obstacles will have a significant impact on your overall speed. I have found this to be more interesting than just allowing the grav-lev control to elevate you over whatever obstacles are in your path without much need for thought or planning. Okay, I think this covers everything about how this system is intended to work. It's working very well in single player, demonstrating the model is sound. It's still suffering from heavy load in multiplayer though, so I need to work out making it more robust and stable under expected server loads. To optimize, the system can delay processing of the control system update and also raycasts, so I need to determine which of those, maybe both, are making the sim less stable under heavy loads. But what we had in 3.0 and has been seen in some of the videos of the PTU 3.1.4 build, that those are major bugs, not just instabilities due to load. I am definitely making progress at resolving those bugs, and the experience is getting much closer to the intended behavior. Thanks for taking the time to read about how the system is designed and expected to work. At this point, I'm open to any questions, and I will link down below that thread if people do want to ask more questions. However, some were answered, and I will go over them quickly now. So he goes on to answer some questions in regards to Vtol and Thrust. The goal for a while has been to move to a system where there are two kinds of thrusters. One can generate a relatively low but sustained thrust level, and the other can generate much higher but short duration thrust burst. The first type would be used for something like holding a ship aloft in atmosphere, while the second would be used for high-speed maneuvers. This way we aren't held to unrealistic expectations that whatever maneuvering acceleration a ship supports is also the amount of VTOL thrust it can support. This is why our ships are tuned for high-speed space combat maneuvering and can generally counter gravity with such ease. If a ship can maneuver at 15G, staying aloft in 1G isn't a challenge. It can do that and still have 14G for maneuvers. So that's definitely the direction we're going. That isn't in my current IFCS refactor, however. I'm setting it up, but we're not there yet. It's the goal that all fuel use is tied to thruster activity. If that bears out, then yes, taking advantage of downward thrust to keep a vehicle down in low gravity would come with a fuel cost. The current fuel model isn't accurately modelled. There is suggestions that in the future, Gravlev should not use fuel unless it's actually using its thrusters to move, which would mean you'd have very good distance on bikes, especially if you get up to like cruising speed. You could basically turn off your thrusters and just let the bike glide at high speed. Gravity will affect how Gravlev system operates, obviously. Potentially bikes and Gravlev craft will generate very little IR and EM, especially when cruising. And when they're low to the ground, they're going to be harder to detect in general. Once they have fixed the issues with Gravlev under light server loads, they're going to look at issues of the heavy server loads and how to fix that as well. The goal is for hover vehicles to have their own utility, basically. So they want those space bikes, they want those the Nox and the Dragonfly to fit somewhere in the Pantheon that is useful. It was confirmed that you will be able to pilot a Nox or Dragonfly from space to surface and vice versa now. They don't have realistic orbital mechanics, so there's no reason why you would need to enter the atmosphere at high velocity and then use the atmosphere as a brake, causing burn-in. Any burn-in in-game is really just for show and rule of cool. In regards to low gravity jumping, there isn't really much of a point to a hover vehicle in low gravity. A low gravity jump is more like flying without elevation control. You might as well just switch to normal flight at that point. But it's up to the designers to decide at what gravity level it switches from cool, I'm getting big air, to okay, you can come down at any time now. There are plans potentially for there to be angle and elevation limits to the Gravlev when in HOV mode. You may also need to avoid or pitch up over certain obstacles. Currently, you can fall from any distance because Gravlev will kick in and give you sufficient upward force to catch you just before you hit the ground. But you might take damage from falling from certain heights in certain gravities in the future. I know that was a slightly rambly, massive drop of info on the Gravlev system, but it was great to see a dev come out and really over-explain what he's doing on the system currently, and I hope we see this for many other systems. John Pritchett did also suggest that this would be done for the IFCS, which is basically the flight model system, before 3.2 comes out in June, which would be great to see. But I'd love to see it for so many different things. If the devs want to come out and do these giant posts like this and then answer questions, and again, I will put links to this grav-lev QA and continuing discussion about grav-lev up in the comments below. So up in the comments below, down in the comments below, and in the description as well. But as I said, tell me what you think of the grav-lev feature, of hoverbikes, improvements that you'd like to see to it, things you don't like about it, whatever, in the comments below.